You might fancy yourself a trivia master when it comes to the golden oldies, confident you have memorised every beat and lyric of pop culture history. However, there is a massive blind spot in that confidence. Imagine stepping onto a massive broadcast stage, knowing that millions of judgmental eyes are glued to your every move. Now consider a single unscripted split second so jarring it could kill a legendary series instantly. The Honeymooners didn't just alter the comedy landscape, it shattered it. Yet, lurking beneath those raw-inducing gags was a moment so volatile, it was effectively erased from the collective memory for decades. We're about to expose the grim reality that executives tried to hide from the public eye. Jackie Gleason's personal demons didn't just influence the show, they ignited a sitcom revolution. Long before the series became an American icon, it was born from deep-seated trauma. Gleason didn't merely invent the character of Ralph Cramden, he was channeling his own haunted existence. Growing up in the gritty streets of Brooklyn, he was intimately acquainted with destitution. The tragedy started when his father abandoned the family. Just as Jackie turned 9, leaving him with a mother who scraped by on menial wages just to keep them alive. That profound sense of desertion scarified his soul, directly fueling the explosive rage and frustration found in Ralph. Cramden, a blustering bus driver whose grandiose ambitions were constantly suffocated by his meagre income. The world first met this volatile character on the Cavalcade of Stars back in 1951. It was a visceral, thunderous performance that defied every television norm of the era. While other networks peddled polished fantasies of suburbia Gleason, forced viewers into a dilapidated tenement showcasing screaming matches between husband and wife and the crushing weight of poverty. It resonated instantly. Then there was Alice Cramden Ralph's sharp-tongued spouse, who became a legend in her own right. Yet finding the perfect Alice was a chaotic ordeal. Audrey Meadows almost lost the gig entirely because the suits at CBS deemed her far too elegant for the role. Refusing to accept defeat, Meadows commissioned a fresh set of headshots stripped of all makeup and clad in frumpy attire to prove she could play down her looks. But here is the secret: Meadows was not the first Alice. That honour belonged to Pert Kelton, an actress who brought a genuine grit and hardness to the role. Tragically, just as the show was skyrocketing, she was unceremoniously fired. The studio claimed it was due to health problems, but the actual cause was far more sinister. Politics. Kelton's husband had fallen under the scrutiny of the McCarthy-era Red Scare. Mere rumours of communist sympathies were all it took for the cowardly executives at CBS to destroy her career. The infamous Hollywood blacklist had clawed its way into the Honeymooners. This silent political purge fundamentally shifted the series' dynamic, swapping Kelton's abrasive fire for Meadows' a unique blend of warmth and sharp wit. While die-hard purists insist Kelton had more raw energy, Meadows injected a necessary heart into Alice, allowing the show to endure well beyond the dark days of the blacklist. This was never your standard glossy sitcom. It was a mirror reflecting the harsh realities of life, and the American public was captivated. So why did the Honeymooners revolutionise television forever? When the sketches evolved into a standalone series in 1955, it shattered the existing template. During an age when the airwaves were saturated with pristine families and flawless households, Gleason presented a claustrophobic, noisy flat and a marriage that always seemed seconds away from detonation. You wouldn't find any perfectly trimmed lawns or carefree children here. Only mounting debts, shattered aspirations and aggressive catchphrases like, "One of these days, Alice Bang." Zoom. For the very first time, the medium made the blue-collar struggle the main attraction. Ralph Cramden possessed no wealth, no wisdom, and zero success. He was deeply, undeniably flawed, mirroring the very people tuning in. That was the brilliance of it. The audience saw their own reflections, men trapped in dead-end labour, women fighting to keep the household afloat, couples screaming, making up and trying again. The Honeymooners refused to sanitize existence. It interrogated it under a harsh spotlight. Prior to this, hits like Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver offered a hazy, soft focus. Fantasy of reality. They served up groomed fathers dispensing sage wisdom in sprawling suburban homes. In stark contrast, Gleeson gave us a one-room tenement with peeling wallpaper centering the action around a kitchen table that served as a combat zone for broken dreams. Gleeson's roots in live performance heavily dictated the show's chaotic rhythm. Every instalment unfolded like a theatrical production performed live with absolutely no second chances. The scripts were razor tight, the banter cutting, and the pacing exhausting. It felt authentic because it was. Gleeson, who had sharpened his skills in the unforgiving worlds of vaudeville and stage, insisted on that frantic energy. You could practically touch the tension in every delivery. Canned laughter was unnecessary. The studio audience roared because the punchlines landed with impact and the underlying emotions were raw. The structure also played a huge role. Being an anthology of sorts, every episode stood alone without complex story arcs. You weren't required to track continuity from week to week. You could tune in randomly and witness a complete narrative arc packed with genuine heart and knockout humour. And naturally, there were the immortal catchphrases. To the moon, Alice, and baby, you're the greatest, were far more than scripted dialogue. They became permanent cultural tattoos. These phrases reverberated through factories, living rooms, and eventually the halls of political power. They were ubiquitous, embedding themselves into the American vernacular. Yet the show's legacy extended far beyond comedy. It built the foundation for gritty successes like All in the Family, Roseanne, and even The Simpsons. Without the path forged by the Honeymooners characters like Archie Bunker and Homer Simpson would simply not exist. Gleeson kicked the door wide open for dysfunctional families, genuine conflict, and humour derived from authentic pain. But we must return to the central mystery. What actually transpired that fateful night? On the evening the segment aired, nobody anticipated it would rewrite television history. It wasn't explicitly graphic or filled with profanity, yet it transgressed a boundary that had been silently established in the early days of broadcasting. The episode, titled The Deciding Vote, premiered in October 1956. At first glance, it appeared to be just another standard instalment. Ralph, deluded into thinking his single ballot could sway an entire election, spirals toward inevitable public shame. However, it was a solitary, unscripted deviation that altered the entire landscape. In the midst of a blistering argument between Ralph and Alice, Gleeson roared his trademark bang zoom, straight to the moon threat. But on this occasion, it was absolutely not played for comedic effect. His menacing posture and dark tone stripped away the humour completely. The studio audience fell into a deathly silence. Even the production crew reportedly froze in terror. Suddenly, Ralph wasn't a lovable buffoon. He appeared genuinely dangerous. Critics labelled the moment too real, while disturbed viewers flooded the network with letters expressing deep concern rather than amusement. It ignited a firestorm regarding the trivialisation of domestic abuse. Although the catchphrase was a staple of the series, this specific delivery peeled back the comedic veneer to reveal something ugly. What remains largely unknown, however, is that this scene was merely the tip of the iceberg. CBS brass were already deeply anxious about the show's trajectory. Viewership numbers were beginning to slide, the on-set energy was curdling, and Gleeson himself was becoming dangerously unpredictable during live broadcasts. This terrifying outburst only confirmed their worst nightmares. Behind the curtain, animosity was reaching a boiling point. Audrey Meadows had allegedly voiced private discomfort regarding how certain sequences were being filmed, particularly when the boundary between slapstick and genuine aggression began to blur. The sheer emotional gravity of that episode, coupled with Gleeson's unscripted ferocity, compelled the network to take immediate drastic action. Although they never issued a public admission, insiders have long whispered that a direct order came from the highest levels to pull the plug. The final verdict was delivered swiftly and in total secrecy, hidden away behind closed boardroom doors. In a shocking turn of events, just weeks later, the curtain fell on The Honeymooners, bringing its legendary run of original episodes to an abrupt halt after only 39 installments. A critical factor often swept under the rug was the mounting anxiety coming from Madison Avenue. Advertisers were beginning to sweat, with several major sponsors terrified of a potential public relations nightmare fueled by conservative families, church organisations and women's advocacy groups. These corporate giants were desperate to avoid having their household brands linked to a programme that appeared to trivialise domestic conflict, even if the intent was purely comedic. One heavy-hitting sponsor went so far as to issue an ultimatum threatening to withdraw their funding entirely. That threat proved to be the final nail in the coffin. In reality, it wasn't a single controversial line that doomed The Honeymooners. It was a perfect storm of executive panic stern warnings and a cultural tide that was gradually turning against that brand of humour. The controversial scene in question was merely the spark that lit a powder keg waiting to explode. But what actually transpired after the studio lights were killed in the wake of that sudden and jarring conclusion? The Honeymooners simply evaporated from the primetime lineup, leaving a void in the schedule. However, the aftermath was far from finished. Fans were left scratching their heads in confusion as the network released absolutely no official statement to explain the disappearance. One day the Cramdens were there, and by the next they had vanished into thin air. Behind the curtain, however, the fallout was chaotic and loud. Jackie Gleason took the cancellation as a heavy blow. He was much more than just the face on the screen. He was the creator, the visionary, and the undeniable soul of the production. He had poured vast amounts of his own personality into the character of Ralph Cramden. For him, Ralph wasn't just a role to play. He was a mirror reflection of his own struggles. The cancellation felt like a deeply personal rejection. In candid interviews years down the line, Gleason confessed that the relentless pressure of performing the show live every single week had ground him down. He possessed an obsessive desire to make every second on screen flawless. But the demands of the industry were relentless and unforgiving. Most fans remain unaware that Gleason never truly walked away from The Honeymooners. In a move that was incredibly savvy for a performer in the 1950s, he quietly negotiated to purchase the rights back from the network. He kept the spirit alive by resurrecting the characters in sketches on his variety programmes for the next 2 decades, typically reuniting with Audrey Meadows and Art Carney to recreate the magic. These later iterations often featured bloated runtimes and leaned into a softer, more sentimental tone with increased sensitivity. However, they invariably failed to capture the gritty raw vitality that defined the classic 39 episodes. Meanwhile, Audrey Meadows decided to pivot sharply in her professional life. She effectively retired from acting after her stint on The Honeymooners, shifting her formidable focus toward the corporate world and shattering glass ceilings to become one of the first women appointed to the board of a major financial institution, Consolidated Savings and Loan. Her true power, both in front of the camera and in the boardroom, was proven by her ability to walk away from Hollywood while she was still at the very top of her game. As for the man behind Norton, Art Carney fared better than most character actors. He proved his dramatic chops and won an Academy Award for his stellar performance in the film Harry and Tonto in 1974. He continued working steadily for decades, remaining close personal friends with Gleason, although their professional trajectories rarely intersected after the show ended. The public reaction to the show's cancellation was a complicated blend of heavy nostalgia and confusion. While the network maintained a stoic silence, the viewing public demanded answers. Fan mail flooded the offices for years following the cancellation. Syndicated reruns began attracting massive new audiences who fell in love with the laughter, the energy, and the blue-collar realism. Nevertheless, the Hollywood machine marched on without looking back. The sudden demise of the show signalled a shift in what networks were willing to broadcast live. It forced studio executives to reconsider the impact of tone and content. Television comedies became increasingly polished, sanitised and safe in the wake of the Honeymooners. Editorial control and tape delays took precedence over the unpredictable electric nature of live television comedy. In the years that followed, Gleeson poured his energy into his variety shows, yet the Honeymooners always occupied a massive space in his heart. What appeared on the surface to be harmless slapstick had actually walked a very dangerous line, one that nearly cost the franchise its entire legacy. Then came Gleeson's second attempt at glory. Once the original run of the Honeymooners had concluded, Jackie Gleeson refused to let the concept fade quietly into television history. Instead, he embarked on a mission to recapture that lightning in a bottle. However, things were not quite the same the second time around. During the revival in the 1960s, Gleeson resurrected the characters as part of his new venture, The Jackie Gleeson Show, which had moved its production base down to sunny Miami. While there were fresh sketches featuring the Cramdens in this comeback, they lacked the punch and grit of the original masterpieces. The most glaring change was in the structure. The early episodes of The Honeymooners were celebrated for being short, sharp, and incredibly potent. But when Gleeson revived the concept in the 1960s, the episodes became self-indulgent and long. There were instances where they stretched on for an hour or more. The tight, claustrophobic tension of the original was lost, and the humour often felt disconnected from the grounded reality of the situation. These new episodes, filmed in colour, utilised pristine sets and harsh, bright lighting. Consequently, the show lost that dingy working-class atmosphere that had made the original so relatable feeling, instead overly commercialised and artificial. The dynamic of the ensemble cast had also undergone a shift. When Gleeson, Art Carney and Audrey Meadows reunited, the chemistry was noticeably different. Gleeson had aged significantly, and his performance lacked the manic, hungry spark he possessed in the 1950s. Although Carney and Gleeson still had a rapport and Norton remained the lovable fool, the telepathic connection seemed to have faded. There were certainly flashes of brilliance in the revival, but it consistently failed to replicate the impeccable timing and frantic energy of the original series. The decision to film the revival in Miami was driven by a mix of financial incentives and creative demands. Gleeson had secured a deal that granted him total control, and he was lured by the tax breaks and manufacturing benefits that made Miami an attractive hub for his business interests. He attempted to clone the elements that made the first show special, but he discovered that you cannot manufacture atmosphere. The original Honeymooners derived its intensity from the era, the desperate hunger of the cast, and the adrenaline of live broadcast. Once those safety nets were reinstated, the revival simply couldn't match the visceral rawness of the debut run. This is why The Honeymooners still resonates today. Despite only having one full season, it left a crater of impact on the cultural landscape. There were initially 39 episodes, and television stations broadcast them on a loop for decades, embedding them as a ritualistic fixture in American households. Over time, The Honeymooners garnered deep respect, evolving from a TV show into a cornerstone of American folklore and pop culture. It displayed the financial and emotional struggles of the average family in a manner never before seen on screen. Ralph Cramden wasn't a sanitised hero or a perfect husband, but that flaw was the secret to the show's beauty. He was a man that the audience could see themselves in. And while Norton's absurd antics provided necessary comic relief, it was Alice's sharp tongue and quick wit that counterbalanced Ralph's grandiose delusions and constant failures. The show's minimalist structure, relying on just 4 main characters and confining most of the action to a bleak Brooklyn kitchen, was revolutionary. It proved that a sitcom could thrive without a massive ensemble or complex, expensive locations. All it required was a believable family dynamic, honest writing, and actors who looked and sounded like real human beings. The Honeymooners did more than just achieve fleeting popularity. As the decades rolled on, countless sitcoms borrowed heavily from its blueprint. Ralph and Alice Cramden provided the direct inspiration for Fred and Wilma Flintstone. whose dynamic was a prehistoric mirror of the Brooklyn couple. Furthermore, even modern giants like The Simpsons drew from that same well to craft the relationship between Homer and Marge. The simplicity of its structure, highlighting the daily grind of the working class, became the gold standard for future generations of television. But ultimately, the true legacy of The Honeymooners lies in its emotional integrity, not just its format. The series refused to whitewash the gritty reality of a post-war American family trying to survive the daily grind. Ralph was frequently volatile and quick to anger, yet that rough exterior never truly obscured the deep devotion he held for his wife. The narrative tackled the genuine struggles of the era, highlighting financial desperation and the hunger for upward mobility. While maintaining a veneer of comedy and warmth, the hardships the Cramdens endured felt incredibly visceral. They came across as flesh and blood people, defined by Ralph's explosive temper and Alice's razor-sharp comebacks. It was this constant friction between their lofty dreams and their stark reality that made them so relatable. Unlike the millions of sanitized family programs airing at the time, this was just a couple scraping by. It wasn't interested in preaching moral lessons to the audience. Introducing a flawed working-class protagonist was a revolutionary concept for television. Before the Honeymooners sitcoms depicted a fantasy of perfection. Screens were filled with sprawling suburban estates, luxury vehicles, and angelic children. This show, however, broke that mold entirely. It centred on Ralph Cramden, a frustrated bus driver perpetually chasing a break. He desperately wanted a slice of the pie for himself and his wife, yet he always came up short. In doing so, the show exposed a vulnerability and human fragility that had never been broadcast before. Ralph wasn't a tycoon or a corporate executive. He was an average Joe fighting to keep his head above water. That authenticity made his character and the series itself utterly captivating. However, one specific infamous sequence rocked the foundation of The Honeymooners and ultimately contributed to its demise. It remains one of the most debated moments in the history of the medium. In the context of the 1950s, it was electrifying, though modern eyes might view it differently. At a time when households gathered to watch wholesome entertainment, this was a shock to the system. This occurred during an era when the television industry was still defining its identity. The Honeymooners refused to conform to the safe cookie-cutter formula of its contemporaries. That refusal to play it safe eventually landed the production in hot water. The controversial moment unfolded during the episode titled The $99,000 Answer. In this specific installment, Jackie Gleason's character delivers a threatening quip to his wife Alice, promising to send her straight to the moon with a punch. Considering the abrasive nature of the show, the dialogue was interpreted as something far more sinister than a simple gag. Although some might dismiss it today, at the time it triggered a significant backlash. Critics and viewers alike began to view the catchphrase as a grim metaphor for domestic abuse. Even if the intent was comedic, the audience perceived a much darker undercurrent in the interaction. It highlighted Ralph's simmering rage over his constant failures in life. Back then, broadcast television strictly avoided any real discussion regarding domestic violence or spousal conflict. In fact, many heavy societal issues we prioritise today, such as abuse, mental health struggles, and systemic poverty, were almost never acknowledged on air. In this segment of The Honeymooners, Ralph's outburst seemed to peel back the curtain on a violent side of his psyche, shattering the wholesome illusion of the time. Suddenly, a programme that was celebrated for its honest depiction of blue-collar life found itself at the centre of a heated national conversation. The discourse shifted to how television influences perceptions of marriage. Gleason was forced to confront the reality that not all boundaries could be pushed without consequences. The production faced immense pressure from sponsors, executives, and the network itself. Despite the fact that The Honeymooners was a ratings juggernaut and incredibly popular, the fallout from this specific scene caused the powers that be to reconsider the show's future. Ultimately, The Honeymooners was unceremoniously cut short. The cancellation was likely driven by multiple factors, including shifting cultural values, However, the controversy surrounding that scene served as a major tipping point. It signalled the end of a golden era for the series and highlighted how rapidly public opinion regarding television content and gender roles was evolving. While The Honeymooners was undeniable in its innovation, this scandal served as a sobering warning that even the most progressive entertainment had lines it couldn't cross. This was particularly true when navigating sensitive social topics. The ripple effects of that scene extended far beyond the lifespan of The Honeymooners itself. It effectively prepped audiences for the next evolution of television, where programmes tackling controversial subjects would face intense scrutiny. In many respects, it laid the groundwork for gritty sitcoms of the 1970s like All in the Family, which would boldly confront uncomfortable truths. The show pushed the envelope, expanding the boundaries of what was acceptable. It also forced viewers to become more conscious of how media shapes their views on relationships. What followed proved that Gleason's brilliance didn't fade away. He managed to transform a professional failure into a lasting legacy that reshaped American television. It is fascinating to look back and see how The Honeymooners achieved the status of a cultural icon in the decades that followed its cancellation. Initially, it was perceived as too raw and abrasive for its era, yet it eventually became the gold standard against which all future sitcoms were measured. This influence is visible in how characters interact and how modern comedy narratives are structured. Despite only airing for a single season, its impact has spanned generations. As reruns began circulating on local stations years later, the series was discovered by an entirely new demographic. The show's unfiltered, honest humour remained timeless. Elements that were once deemed controversial felt fresh and innovative to new eyes. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the show experienced a massive resurgence. During this revival, it was recognised as a foundational pillar of American entertainment. This shift in perspective was likely due to how perfectly it captured the essence of the American struggle. The appeal wasn't just about Alice's saintly patience or Ralph's bizarre schemes. It was about the universal problems that everyday people wrestle with. It perfectly encapsulated the frustration of the average citizen trying to navigate a world that rarely gives them a lucky break. The Honeymooners wasted no time in displaying just how messy and chaotic life can be. That raw honesty was a massive part of its enduring charm. As the television landscape matured, audiences began craving content that felt authentic. They tired of the flawless, fabricated family dynamics of the past. There are countless ways in which The Honeymooners paved the way for a new age of broadcasting. Over time, it became a harbinger of the future of the sitcom format. We began to see fewer light-hearted fantasies and more realistic portrayals of domestic life. Shows like The Mary Tyler Moore Show borrowed heavily from its DNA. Writers learned how to balance comedy with serious issues like marriage strife and class politics. Ralph Cramden wasn't just a character of the 50s, he was an eternal figure. This is evidenced by the fact that the show's themes of thwarted ambition and economic struggle have heavily influenced subsequent generations of TV stars. The enduring obsession with The Honeymooners proves that its characters are timeless. Even in our modern age of reality TV, the legacy of the Cramdens remains untouched. It is essential to remind the audience that sometimes the most simplistic concepts yield the most beautiful results. The legendary sequences from The Honeymooners, the sharp wit, the visceral physical comedy, and the kinetic way the characters bounced off one another fundamentally altered the trajectory of how situation comedies would be crafted for generations to come. That infamous moment where Ralph threatens to send Alice straight to the moon might have sparked intense debate and controversy back in the day, but viewed through a modern lens, it is recognised as a hallmark of an era when television was still discovering its boundaries, figuring out what was humorous and what was acceptable for the public eye. The Honeymooners' impact on the landscape of modern television is undeniable. Despite having a run that was shockingly brief, The Honeymooners cast a colossal shadow over the industry. Its influence on the genre was seismic. It stood as a pioneer, being one of the very first programmes to bravely showcase that it was perfectly acceptable to broadcast deeply flawed, authentic human beings, which subsequently paved the way for an entire lineage of gritty television. When it premiered in 1955, the series was far more than a simple vehicle for laughs. It served as a bold social experiment to gauge how the American public would respond to protagonists who were arguably the antithesis of the pristine, polished families featured on rival networks at the time. Ralph Cramden, brought to life by the incomparable Jackie Gleason, was a boisterous, loud-mouthed and occasionally excessive working-class bus driver who spent the majority of his waking hours dreaming up schemes for a more luxurious existence. Alice Ralph's incredibly patient and sharp-witted wife was equally grounded in reality. While she was far from the submissive archetype, she found herself constantly managing the fallout of Ralph's chaotic and ill-conceived master plans. The core reason audiences fell in love with them, despite their glaring lack of perfection as a couple, was precisely because of that friction. Viewers could see themselves in Ralph's constant frustrations, his lofty ambitions, and his consistently clumsy attempts to grasp those dreams. This programme finally gave a loud, clear voice to the working class, and ever since that moment, sitcoms have been chasing that same echo. Starting with the gritty revolution of sitcoms in the 1970s, The Honeymooners left a massive imprint. Shows like All in the Family, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and even the animated satire of The Simpsons owe a significant debt of gratitude to The Honeymooners for establishing how effortless it could be to digest character-driven narratives. Much like The Honeymooners, the primary objective of these successor shows was never to depict immaculate, well-behaved households. Their goal was to expose the raw, messy, and often chaotic underbelly of real life. They presented the audience with genuine people, not merely two-dimensional caricatures, displaying individuals grappling with romantic relationships, dead-end jobs, and thwarted ambition just like the rest of us. In the contemporary era, comedies such as The Office and Parks and Recreation remain heavily indebted to the blueprint laid out by The Honeymooners. These modern masterpieces share a distinct DNA with The Honeymooners in that they both highlight the absurdity of everyday problems and the eccentricities of strange, lovable characters. However, while the lineage is clear, their stylistic execution and tone have evolved. Many modern sitcom protagonists, much like Ralph and Alice harbour massive dreams that exceed their grasp. They become irrationally furious at the trivial inconveniences of life that refuse to go their way, stumbling and making significant errors along the journey. Furthermore, the show revolutionised the very architecture of how sitcoms were assembled. The Honeymooners refused to adhere to the rigid, formulaic patterns of the era. Instead, the creators utilised a much more fluid structure that permitted larger, emotionally resonant character arcs. This was a stark departure from the standard disposable one-off episodes of the 1950s. And it opened the door for deeper, more sophisticated storytelling that eventually became the gold standard for modern television. The Honeymooners holds the distinction of being one of the earliest programmes to successfully meld slapstick comedy with poignant social commentary. Its innovation wasn't merely found in its humorous cast or its situational plots. Ralph's perpetual dissatisfaction with his menial employment, his constant financial struggles, and his unfulfilled aspirations were all components of a much larger cultural dialogue regarding the elusive American dream and the brutal reality of the working-class struggle. In many respects, the series was decades ahead of the curve, predicting the wave of social realism that would eventually dominate the airwaves in the 1970s and the years that followed. The genius of the Honeymooners lay in their ability to remain uproariously funny and culturally relevant, while simultaneously addressing heavy topics like matrimonial strife, class warfare, and ambition. The show never shied away from highlighting Ralph's character defects, his explosive anger, his selfishness, and his desperation. Yet it framed these traits in a way that rendered him a sympathetic, three-dimensional human being. The Honeymooners was not simply a comedy, it was a vital piece of cultural history because it fundamentally rewrote the rules on how characters could be portrayed on the small screen. We must discuss the enduring magnetism of the Honeymooners. It is almost incomprehensible that a show as revolutionary as this had such a fleeting production life. Despite only airing for a single season in 1955, the programme cemented itself as an integral pillar of television history. What was once viewed as potentially controversial for its gritty depiction of a struggling couple has metamorphosed into a bona fide cult classic. The legacy of the show continues to vibrate through the culture decades later, and it is now universally acclaimed as one of the most significant sitcoms ever produced. So one must ask, what is the secret ingredient that allows the Honeymooners to survive? A massive part of it is the sheer relatability of the narrative. While the geopolitical landscape has shifted dramatically since the 1950s, the battles that Ralph and Alice fight, working themselves to the bone just to scrape by navigating a marriage that is a roller coaster of emotional highs and lows, and striving to elevate their station in life, are absolutely timeless. These are universal struggles that resonate with every single generation, and it is that piercing authenticity that has kept the show relevant through the ages. Another critical factor in the Honeymooners' seemingly eternal appeal is the cast itself. Jackie Gleason's tour de force portrayal of Ralph Cramden stands as one of the most iconic television performances in history. Ralph's profound flaws, his larger-than-life persona, and his often delusional sense of grandeur create a character that viewers are compelled to adore even when they are howling with laughter at his misfortunes. Alice, portrayed by the brilliant Audrey Meadows, serves as the perfect foil to Ralph, providing a grounded, sensible counterweight that balances his wildest antics. Together they create a dynamic that remains one of the most beloved television partnerships of all time. The physical comedy as well possesses an ageless quality. Gleason's mastery of slapstick humour and his uncanny ability to react to his co-stars helped define the show's unique tone and visual style. Even as the medium of television evolved into high definition, the classic comedic beats, whether it was Ralph's signature threats or his absurd get-rich-quick schemes, continue to elicit genuine laughter today, decades after they were first broadcast. It is that rare alchemy of relatable characters, physical mastery, and timeless themes that has guaranteed the Honeymooners a permanent seat in the pantheon of TV history. The show's lasting appeal is also a testament to its structural integrity and ability to weather the changing tides of culture. While countless other programmes from the 1950s have faded into total obscurity, The Honeymooners remains a vibrant cultural touchstone. It has sparked an infinite number of references across pop culture, influencing everything from Hollywood blockbusters to other television series. It continues to be celebrated through endless reruns availability on streaming platforms and even special anniversary commemorations. In a fast-paced world where television shows appear and vanish with lightning speed, The Honeymooners stands as a monument to the power of timeless character work and universal storytelling. Its uncanny ability to connect with modern audiences, even decades after its cancellation, speaks volumes about its status as a true cultural icon. Over the years, the immense popularity of The Honeymooners has birthed numerous revivals, stage adaptations and tributes, all showcasing its indelible impact on the medium. From Broadway adaptations to feature film versions, The Honeymooners continues to inspire fresh generations of content creators who view it as the ultimate model of what television is capable of achieving. It demonstrates that. Even when the cameras finally stop rolling and the controversy quiets down, the ripples of a show like this continue to shake the industry, leaving behind a complicated legacy that simply refuses to be forgotten by the public. I truly appreciate you sticking around to the very end to explore this fascinating piece of entertainment history with me. If you found this deep dive intriguing, please make sure to hit that like button, share the gossip with your circle and subscribe so you never miss out on the next big reveal. The story does not have to end here. There is another shocking tale waiting for you right on your screen, so click through to keep the binge session going.